Game engines have three major elements: a graphics layer abstraction, physics or collision detection, and a game object or entity component system. First, I added basic top-down movement and character art. You play as a little white square that flies around the screen. I'm not an artist, but I believe aesthetics and consistency are more important than visual fidelity. I decided then to embrace the programmer art stereotype and make everything in the game a geometric primitive with a solid color. It made sense to make the background one solid color too, which is great because that's as easy as calling a single method in Monogame. Monogame is the framework I use to make my game in. When making a game, the lowest level of abstraction you can achieve is making calls directly to the graphics card and programming everything else yourself from scratch. The highest level you can achieve is building your game with an engine. A framework is a nice middle ground that typically provides a graphics layer abstraction, sound management, input, and basic game math. I wanted to implement a game over condition as fast as I could, so I made red squares that chase the player around and stop the game when they touch him. To quickly add variation, I gave enemies a size field that determines their physical size, speed, and health. Bigger enemies are slower and harder to kill, smaller enemies are faster and tougher to catch, but die in one hit. When I spawn an enemy, I simply assign a random value between 1 and 3 to their size. Collision between the enemy and player was simple to implement since Monogame comes with a robust rectangle class. I defined each object's hitbox as a rectangle, and if two rectangles intersect, that means they're colliding. If the two objects are colliding, call their respective collision response methods, passing in information about the collision. This includes the direction, the overlap rectangle, and the other colliding object. For the player's collision response, you check what type the colliding object is, and if it's an enemy, then it's game over. I want to talk about entities and game objects now because it's hard to keep track of things in your game, such as enemies, without using one of those concepts. In object-oriented programming languages with garbage collection, an object exists so long as another object has a reference to it. If you were to spawn an enemy without caching a reference to it, it would despawn as soon as the end of the scope is reached. We want enemies to stay on screen for as long as we need them to, so the way we do that is by defining a persistent data structure to hold a reference to all our enemies. A great choice for this data structure is a hash map, parameterized by whichever object you're trying to represent as the value, and an unsigned int as the key. Make sure to save the unsigned int as a local ID field in the enemy class so it can eventually delete itself. Now, back to the game. To give the player a fighting chance, I added a shotgun that spawns 3 bullets, 1 projecting from the barrel and 2 on either side, offset by an arbitrary angle. Since I was strapped for time, and again, since I'm not an artist, I decided not to bother with a gun spray. To indicate when the gun is ready to shoot, I have a cocking sound effect play when the cooldown is halfway done. The cooldown is short enough that the gun is ready to shoot by the time the sound effect ends. One big tip for anyone making a game with limited resources or experience is to utilize the power of sound. Good sound effects go a long way in making your game feel satisfying. One comment I received on my game is that the contrast between the realistic sound effects and the square player enemies was entertaining, which I took as a compliment. Also, sound effects are easy to implement in 2D games, and you can often get them for free from websites like FreeSound or OpenGameArt, so there's no excuse not to use them. I wanted to make killing enemies as satisfying as possible because it's the main feature of the core game loop, and that should feel as good as it can. To do this, I created my own particle system to make enemies explode. When one dies, I make a call to a class named Gore Factory, which takes an enemy as a parameter and spawns a random number of small red squares where the enemy is located. Each red square is given a random direction and speed that decays over time. The number of random particles spawned is determined by the size of the enemy, and particles fade and despawn after 10 seconds. I also added an exploding head sound effect. The end product is a satisfying kill that reminds me of a bloody mess in Fallout. To prevent this effect from getting old, I made it so you must deal a massive amount of damage to your enemy right before he dies for the effect to trigger. I thought it would be interesting if critical kills affected gameplay too, so I made them double the chance of an enemy dropping gold. So I added money into the game, and at some point the UI just kinda snuck its way in there. The last thing I really wanted to add was a grenade, which was surprisingly easy. When the player clicks the right mouse button, I spawn a green square on his location with a velocity in the direction of the mouse pointer. The speed interpolates to 0, and after about a second, the grenade explodes. When that happens, I enable the grenade's hitbox for a fraction of a second, and any players or enemies who collide with it take damage based on how close they are to the center. At first, I made the hitbox visible for debugging purposes, but decided to keep it in because it didn't look bad and was more obvious to the player. To give the explosion visual flair, I rewrote the Gore Factory code so that it could spawn particles of a specific color. When the grenade explodes, it calls the class's method with a light gray color. After that, I decided it would be a better use of my time in to fix bugs and polish the game rather than introduce new features. So that's it. If you're interested in game programming but don't like working with engines because you would rather write code, I would recommend trying out a framework like Monogame or Raylib. Frameworks are the perfect layer of abstraction for those that don't want to make games with an engine but are also intimidated by the graphics API learning curve. Links in the description for both of those as well as my game. Check them out.